Hello, welcome back to the Underhand Free Throw. I am Simon, and today I wanted to talk about something that is not necessarily strictly basketball analysis related, like we typically do on this channel, but I think it is very relevant. So, the big topic of discussion this year, post All-Star break, if you're very involved in NBA discussion online, you know there's always a big topic that comes up after All-Star break. We're waiting for the games to ramp up and for, teams to really round into form and start pushing towards the playoffs. But there's this little dead spot where we kind of just talk about other ancillary issues that the NBA is having. And this year, the big one has been injuries. There's been a lot of talk about injuries, about players resting, load management, team medical staff imposing player rest on them. And as it does every year, it mostly devolves into just kind of arguing about are players really hurt? Are they just sitting out for injury prevention? Should they be doing that? How does this impact the fans? And I do think there's a discussion willing to be had here. But in this video, I wanted to come at this from a different angle, and mostly by saying the very scary sounding phrase that, injuries in the NBA are actually happening a lot, and it's a problem that's getting worse and not better. And that's a concerning thing to say, and it doesn't really make a lot of sense because we live in an age with the best medical technology ever, right? Every single team employs like a whole slew of doctors and has access to some of the best medical technology money can pay for. And yet, players just get hurt a lot these days, and when they do get hurt, their injuries take a really long time to recover from. And it doesn't make a whole lot of sense logically until you take a slightly deeper dive into it. So I do have a point I ultimately want to get to and make, but the first thing that I want to point to is there's been kind of a change over time in what are the most common injuries that a NBA player is going to face. So traditionally, players would have a lot of physical injuries, whether it's like a hurt back, like a broken foot, some other broken limb, or like pain in various parts of the body. And those still are fairly common for NBA players to experience, but there's been a shift over time in what type of injuries a player is most likely to experience, and it's kind of moved away from like the physical, like bones and aches and pain stuff, and more towards soft tissue injuries. And what I mean by this is typically non-contact. So this is going to be like a torn tendon or a sprained muscle, or something pops when you're running or twisting or turning or cutting, or any of the many things that an NBA player has to do, especially while playing defense in the modern NBA. This is free publicly available data from Spotrac, and it essentially just illustrates that soft tissue injuries today are really common. And I do want to say this isn't exactly like a scientific look into things. I tried my best, but I'll put an example up on screen here now. But a lot of times when a player's injury is reported, it's not always clear exactly what it is unless you dive into the exact tweets of Woj or Shams that day and look if the team had any more specifics. But one example I have here is that Romeo Langford missed 22 games in the 2021 season, and the reported injuries that he experienced during that time were a heel, a hamstring, a groin, an illness, a neck, an ankle, and a calf injury, all in the span of about 3 weeks. So as you can tell, it's not always exactly clear what sort of injuries players are experiencing, but I did dive into the data and I did my best to categorize them based on what was being reported. And I think the most important thing to look at here is that it's pretty clear that these soft tissue injuries, whether that's going to be ankles or probably the groin area, are the two most, obvious examples of soft tissue injuries. It's mostly muscular things that are getting injured in that case. These are making up the majority of injuries that players are experiencing today in terms of the amount of games actually lost due to injury. And the second thing that I wanted to look at is a study that was published in 2021. It was mostly based on how the shortened season due to the pandemic affected player health that following season. And it actually drew some pretty scary conclusions on just how dangerous a shortened season is. Players just get hurt all the time, is essentially what the paper was saying. But they also cited some former studies that had been done prior to, our current time period. And none of this data is necessarily very easy to access. If you want to, you can dive into all the individual reports and pull all of this yourself if you have a spare 2 to 3 years on your hands to do that. But I think one thing that stands out is that, there has been a slight decrease in, just the average amount of injuries that are happening every season, but that hasn't necessarily been the case with the soft tissue parts of the body, whether that's the groin area, whether that's the knee area, or whether that's the ankle. We're basically seeing that things have either remained the same, which is a problem in and of itself, or gotten worse within the last 20 years. And even in the cases of knees, where players injure their knees about as much as they always have in this day and age, that's not necessarily a victory, because you also have to take into account that players play a lot less minutes per game than they used to. They play less games per season than they used to. They theoretically have much better injury prevention methods than they used to, and yet players are hurting themselves just as often, despite, playing less often and preparing better to avoid these kinds of injuries. So that leads us to the question of what exactly has changed since, 20 to 30 years ago to the modern era. Why are players seemingly just as susceptible or even more susceptible to these soft tissue non-contact injuries? Which is really a major concern, because these are the parts of the body where the most dangerous injuries can occur in terms of how it impacts a player's career. It's very unfortunate if a player breaks their leg, but that's something that they can recover from for a couple of months and be back on the court more or less as new. If a player tears their Achilles or has serious knee ligament problems, their career might be over. So these are definitely the kinds of injuries that we'd like to avoid and not see get worse. So I think there's one very obvious thing that has changed over the past 20 to 30 years in the NBA, and that is pace of play, especially in the era where it's all pace and space. There's a lot more motion in NBA offenses than there has been historically. And there's just a lot more space that a defense has to cover on the court to prevent wide open three-point shots and dives to the basket when the floor is spaced. So ultimately what this means is NBA players are running more than they ever have during an NBA game, at least per minute played. They are making more cuts. They are jumping more often. They are changing direction. They are stopping and starting and slowing down or changing their speed. And all of these things are really, really hard on the soft, squishy areas of our bodies. And ultimately, this is kind of a dark, depressing future for the NBA, because the pace that NBA games are played at is just kind of on a steep upward trajectory, and it doesn't really seem to have much end in sight. And even though NBA pace isn't quite at a historic high, it hasn't quite reached the, extremely frantic basketball level of the early 1970s quite yet, players are running the most per game that they ever have. They're actually covering the most ground. So from that standpoint, you could actually make the claim that the NBA game at the moment in 2023 is at an all-time high in terms of the actual physical demand that it's putting on a player's body. So from my vantage point, this is obviously a real problem, and it's something that I really, really hope that, Adam Silver, the NBA, the powers that be, are going to look at and examine over the course of the next few years and try to figure out some way to do a course correction. There is just the overall quality of the basketball itself that, a lot of people who grew up watching basketball 20 to 25 years ago, including myself, would prefer if the game didn't quite have as much scoring and possessions per game as it does now, just because it's starting to resemble a different sport. But apart from selfishly my own desires of, wanting a slightly slower game with a little bit more defense played, I think it's actually starting to become a real player issue now, and it's gone beyond just, what is your basketball preference in watching? Because it's a real concerning trend if our medical knowledge and our ability to prevent injuries and recover from them is getting better, and yet players are getting hurt as much or even more often than they did in the past and taking longer than ever to recover from those injuries. Obviously, something's not working here. And my best guess, as someone who has not performed a scientific study, and unfortunately there hasn't been a real study that's addressed this exact issue published as we speak. Hopefully that'll change soon, but as we speak, we kind of have to draw conclusions using data and insights from things that are not necessarily designed to make this exact point. But I do think, as bad as all these injuries seem to be, as bad as the constant load management and player rest is for the fan experience, it's an unfortunate reality and something that's probably going to get worse before it gets better as the game continues to speed up and players are running more per game, making more turns, jumps, and cuts per game, because these are the kind of situations in which a player will, tear their ACL or Achilles or, some other tendon in their lower body. And a lot of those injuries are going to result in a season of missed time. And also, even after that player comes back, as we've seen with Jamal Murray, it takes a long time after recovering from, a serious knee injury or something like that before you're the same player that you were before you got hurt. So, in some ways, every single time a major injury like this happens, it doesn't happen to every player. A lot of players are going to go their entire career and avoid it, but it really does impact a player's career. So I'd love to see an NBA where these kind of things happen less often, or we at least make efforts in terms of, the actual rules and style of play to try to address this issue. Anyway, that is all for me. If you enjoyed the video and you're still around, feel free to like and subscribe. I'd really appreciate it. But otherwise, you can click here and check out our most latest video that we uploaded. It was me as a Portland Trailblazers fan talking about the future, cautiously optimistic state of my own franchise, which I really enjoyed making. But anyway, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time on the Underhand Free Throw. Goodbye.